what is worship? Have you ever asked yourself that question? What is worship? Like maybe not what is worship, but ask yourself what worship is. Because you say, well, what is worship? What are we doing to worship? And if you were to ask somebody, a modern Christian, you ask people in the room, what is worship? Most of the answer you're going to get is like, well, that's when we sing, right? We sing during worship. Or maybe you talk about worship as some kind of a state that you enter, like it's a passive thing. When all the stars align and all the elements are right, you enter into worship. Maybe you've heard somebody say that the worship was really great today, or that you experienced worship. And the question is like, what are we doing here? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? What's the goal of this? Is what we're doing worship? And you get a lot of different answers depending on who you ask. Like if you were to go and ask an Orthodox Jew, or to step back in time and ask an Old Testament Jew, what is worship? Their idea of worship is very different than ours, right? For them, worship is offering a sacrifice. It's paying a tithe. It's going to the temple and doing something. It's giving something to God. That is worship. And you talk about singing like, well, yeah, I mean, I guess. But that's not really worship. Worship is something you do. And then we enter into the New Testament era, and Jesus has fulfilled the sacrifices, so we're not doing that anymore. And like, well, what is worship for us? Well, worship for us is singing. Okay, we sing songs. That's worship. Maybe somebody will tell you obedience, or they'll tell you giving is worshiping. But it's kind of this vague thing that we never really define and we don't really talk about. And the cool thing about the way that we go through the Bible together by starting in a book and just going all the way through the book is it brings us to topics that maybe we wouldn't have thought about, maybe I wouldn't have talked about otherwise, but it brings us to those topics and causes us to address some things that maybe I just never would have picked out on my own to talk about. And today, I just want to talk about worship and what it is and what it's supposed to be, and then go into where we're at in Mark and see what we can learn from that there. And when you talk about what worship is or what is worship, we actually have a really good definition from the Bible. Hebrews chapter 13, verses 15 and 16 get our definition. And I want to talk to you about this for just a second. The book of Hebrews is written to Jews who had become followers of Jesus that are very confused about what they're supposed to be doing. Because they've grown up with a system of rules, they've grown up with the law and the sacrifice, and they say, okay, Jesus has fulfilled that, I'm not supposed to do that anymore, I don't have to do that anymore, but what am I supposed to do instead? And for them to show up in a passive experience like we have, where it's, you stand up, you sit down, you sing, you do those things, it would be, we're missing something. What is going on? What am I supposed to do to worship? And so the author of Hebrews gives us three things that are worship that we can do. Verse 15 says, through him, then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. So what he says is, you're looking for a sacrifice, and we're not doing animal sacrifices anymore. So here's your sacrifice. And you know from the fact that in verse 15, he starts an idea and says, this is your sacrifice. And then at the end of verse 16, he says, this is your sacrifice. You know, everything in the middle of that is the sacrifice of worship that we're supposed to be giving. So he says, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of the lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have. For such sacrifices are pleasing to God. They're saying, what sacrifice of worship do we give? And he said, this is what you give. Fruit of the lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good, and share what you have. That those three things are what our worship as followers of Jesus should be. Now, some of that, we get a little bit of that covered, right? That fruit of the lips that acknowledge his name. I'm going to shorten that to words that honor him. That's what I'm going to shorten that to, words that honor him. We do that in music. We do that in singing. Everything that we sing is honoring to God. Britt picks out all the music, and we have a lot of conversations about what songs should be there, what songs shouldn't. Does this song have enough depth to it? The word that I always use is meaty. I want the song to have some kind of meat to it. I want it to have something there. And we don't always get that, because we have to pick out what's available to us. We're not writing our own music. But we try to choose songs that have depth to them, that have words that mean something to them. It's just not nonsense phrases. We try to focus on that. And so when you stand here in this place and you sing songs that honor God, that is worship. Yes. But what the author of Hebrews says is that your worship is something that should be taking place from the moment you wake up in the morning until the moment that you go to bed. And honestly, if you're doing that all day long, when we talk about morning to bed, you're going to do that in your dream. Y'all get focused on stuff throughout the week and that's what you dream about? I preach in my dreams, like especially if I'm focused on a sermon, I'm having trouble with it, I'm preaching in my dreams. And when you do that, I don't want to get into that weirdness of dreams, but it's not just morning to evening. If that is a choice that you're making throughout the day, that's going to be something that just comes out the rest of the time. So he says, the author of Hebrews says that worship is something that you should be doing all the time. It's the words that you say. When the words that you say honor God, that is worship. When the things that you do are things that God would have you to do, that is worship. He says, when you do share what you have, that is worship. See, these Jews are looking for an active act of worship. It's almost as if the word act should tell us that it's active. Not a passive experience of worship, that I am led into an emotional state of worship by the musicians on stage, but rather that I choose to worship. I take an intentional step of worship towards God, and the author of Hebrews doesn't argue with that. He said, no, just wait till you hear some of these bands that are going to be around in the 21st century. Like, they're going to take you to a place of... No, you choose to worship by saying words that honor God, by doing things that honor God, and by sharing what you have. Jesus throws a little bit of a caveat on this whenever he's talking about it. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 8, he talks about people that are doing those things, but there's something missing in what they're doing. Matthew chapter 15, verse 8 says, this people honors me. Let's go ahead and go to that, Dan. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. And we're not really focusing on the last half of verse 9 there, but we're focusing on, as Jesus said, these are people that are going through the motions of worship. They're going through the motions of obedience. But it's all lips and no heart. And so the caveat that Jesus throws on this is it's the words that you say, it's the things that you do, it's the way that you share, but that you do them for the purpose of honoring God. That's what makes it worship. Because we live in a culture, unless you watch the Olympics, we live in a culture, at least right here where we're at, where the right thing to do, the socially acceptable thing to do, is to honor God with your lips. The socially acceptable thing to do is to do the thing that God would have you do. That's just part of the culture. The socially acceptable thing to do is to share what you have. And so it's really easy for us to slide into this same place that the Pharisees were, where we do these things that look like worship, and we might call them worship, but because they're not for God, they're just because it's what you do, they're not worship. So let's get some examples of this. So we've got words that honor God. If you say the words that honor God just because it's what's expected or it's the best option for you, that's not worship. That's not worship. Worship with your words is when you honor God because you want to honor God. And that's your motive for doing it. Let me just throw this out here for a second. If you sing the songs you like, but don't sing the songs you don't like, then when you are singing the songs you do like, you're not worshiping. You're entertaining yourself. Because the motive behind your words is not honoring God, it's entertaining yourself. Well, I like that one, so I'm going to sing it. I don't like that one, I'm not going to sing it. And then when we're going to take out unscriptural stuff, heretical stuff, we work really hard not to sing any heresy around here. We try real hard not to do that. Throw some stuff out that are good songs that are kind of confusing about whether they might be heretical or not. So we're going to kick that out of here. But we show up here and you say, I like that song, so I'm going to sing. I don't like that song, I'm not going to sing. You're not choosing to honor God with your lips in a desire to honor God. You're entertaining yourself. When the church that we were at in junior high and high school, we sang out of the old In Spirit and in Truth beige hymnal. And I'm not someone who burns books. But given the option, like if I had to choose a book to burn, it's so boring. The music, so boring. And as a teenager growing up, we had youth choir. Like we had to get up and sing every Sunday night. We had to be there an hour early for practice, and we would sing songs out of the In Spirit and the Truth. And they were so slow, and they were so boring. And I hated singing those songs. And let me tell you, I had to sing them, but it wasn't worship. It wasn't worship for me because I was miserable the whole time. I didn't want to do any of this. But I look back on this from the ripe old age that I am now, and I realize that though those songs were boring and they were not what I wanted to sing, they were honoring to God. And they could have been worship regardless of how I felt about the style, regardless of how I felt about how they were being played, regardless of any of that. Then we go back to the church I was at before that, and we sang out of the Blue Heavenly Highway hymnals, and that's a good time right there if you do it right. That's a good time. And so I would sing with those. I would sing loud because I like those songs. But that wasn't worship because it was about what I wanted to do. It doesn't matter whether you like the song you sing. It's about, do you do this to honor God or not? And let's step away from the music. When you say things, do you say them to bring honor and glory to God, or you say them because that's what's socially acceptable? Would you say that if nobody else was around? I went to my sister's house yesterday to pick her up, to take her to help Joey move. And then I came back in, and I had to use the bathroom, so I went in her apartment. And her roommate and her roommate's mom was there, and I'm sure they're great people. Okay, but the thing that she said when I walked in the apartment, Tasha said, "This is my brother, this is the pastor. The brother that's a pastor." And the woman said, "Oh, we better be on our best behavior then." I'm like, that kind of drives me nuts. Because if you're going to say it, but you're not going to say it in front of me, it doesn't make it better because I'm not around. And it doesn't make it worse because I am around. If your words are not there to honor God, but they're there for the audience that's around, they're not worship. Your actions, the things that you do, can be worship or not, but it depends on your motive. Go ahead and pull up this picture. This is one of my favorite acts of worship, and I really hate that Dennis is not here today. I really hate that he's not here today. This happened back at Camp Rock, and if you're not familiar, if you've not been around, that's our Bible school. We'll just summarize it that way. And we played a game called Wheel Unfortunate, and we had to spin this little wheel, and whatever we landed on was what you had to do. And Dennis, who is, let's just say not an LSU fan, to a degree, quite a bit of a degree, landed on, and I don't know how this worked out, but he managed to land on wear an LSU shirt for the rest of Camp Rock. And you can see him repenting as he is wearing this LSU shirt. And he was really upset by it. I mean, he played along, but he was upset by it. I'm like, you realize this is an act of worship, right? This is an act of worship. Because you're not doing this for yourself. You're doing it because you know it will mean a lot to the kids. And if the kids know that we love them because of these actions that they take, they're more willing to listen to us. They're more willing to come back and give us a shot. So you may hate every moment of this, but this is an act of worship. Or at least it will be if your motive is right. Everything that you do can be an act of worship. Even wearing an LSU shirt. It's not an act of worship for you, Destin, but it is for Dennis. The things that you do. And sharing what you have. Jesus talked a lot about sharing what you have, and he said that if you share with people who are going to share back with you, you don't get any credit for that. Because you're just paying it forward to get paid back. That's what it's for. You help them because they're going to help you. He said when you share with those that you like, with those that you're friends with, it's for you. It's a little bit for them, but it's mostly, there's no reward for that. But when you share knowing that you won't be paid back, knowing that you won't get anything out of this, that gets credit. That is worship. And so the author of Hebrews goes through and he gives us this definition. Go back a slide, Dan. We'll just put that up on the screen. We'll go back to that. Gives us this definition, and we put that together with Jesus. We'll put this together with Jesus said. And he said the words that honor him, doing good, and sharing what you have, all because it honors him, is worship. So when you come in here and it's the beginning of the service and you sing, I just want to ask you, now this is what I was thinking about as a sing, because honestly, I don't do a whole lot of worshiping during the music. I'm focused on everything being ready and making sure I've got things right. Where is Beckham? I'm focused on those things. I'm not really focused on worship. And so today, I tried to focus on what I was saying. And I tried to take it to where it was not just, these words are coming out of my mouth now because this is what we do right now, but trying to worship. And I want to encourage you that when we sing, to sing, and to sing is an act of worship. But to realize that just because somebody else wrote the song doesn't mean it's more worshipful than the words that you say to your husband or wife or kids in the car on the way home. That when you go to the grocery store or you go to the restaurant, that those words can be acts of worship if you choose to let them be. The actions that you perform at work and at home and everywhere else are acts of worship if you do them to honor God. And the way that you share what you have, whether that's money, whether that's stuff, whether that's advice and wisdom or whatever it is that you have to offer, the way that you share can be an act of worship. The Jews said, how are we supposed to worship now that we don't have sacrifices? How are we supposed to do that? And the author of Hebrews says, look, worship is changed, but it's different. Jesus alluded to this, right? He was talking to the woman at the well, and he said, there will come a day that people will not worship at this mountain or that mountain, but rather people worship in spirit and in truth. And that worship is no longer a thing you do on Saturdays, but worship is a thing that you do all day long, every day. That is not extraordinary worship. That is not extra good worship. That is not bonus worship. That is the baseline act of worship that every believer should offer to Jesus every day. That's just how it should be, every day. Now, we're looking at the book of Mark, and the reason that I preface this is because the things we're talking about right now are baseline worship. But there is worship that is extravagant. There's worship that goes just above and beyond, choosing to say the right things to honor God, choosing to do the right things to honor God, choosing to share what I have. There is worship that goes beyond that. And again, it's not something that you get taken to by a sweet guitar solo, but it is something that you choose to enter into when given the opportunity. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We looked through this. We went through all of Mark chapter 14 last week and kind of 10,000-foot view. And so what we're going to do over the next few weeks is we're going to take some of these stories a little bit slower and put them together with some other things. But we're going to look at Mark chapter 14, verse 3, this act of extravagant worship that was above and beyond just saying words, just above and beyond making the right decisions, just above and beyond giving to something that was truly extravagant in the way that he was worshipped. Mark chapter 14, verse 3 says, while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. We talked a little bit about this last week, the cast of characters that are there. Mark just says they're at Simon the leper's house. He's not a leper anymore because they wouldn't be there. He must have been healed by Jesus. They wouldn't have been in that house just because of the situation. He really wouldn't have been allowed to live in town if he was still a leper, but he got cured and they still call him that. I don't know if it's a good thing to be known as Simon the leper once you don't have leprosy anymore. It's like if you're an alcoholic and then you're 10 years sober and everybody calls you Mike the drunk. That's not a fun name to have, but they still call him Simon the leper. They call him Simon the leper. They're there. We've got Lazarus that's there. Not Lazarus that had died, that lived outside the rich man's house, but Lazarus that died, was a friend of Jesus, that died and was brought back to life. We got Mary and Martha, his sisters. These are the ones that were arguing about cleaning whenever he came over to their house. They're good friends. And then we have the disciples that are there around, and there's probably other people there. So they're all gathered up and they're reclining. And the way that they would sit at the table is I don't get it. I don't know how they would do it. But the way they would recline, they would sit at the table is they would sit on the floor and they would lean. And there were different rules for when you lean to the left and different rules for when you lean to the right. But they would lean at these tables and they would just kind of lay there eating their food. And while they're eating, a woman comes with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard. We know that this woman is Mary, the sister of Lazarus. John tells us that. Mary comes in, and she's apparently not been there. Everybody else is there. She's not been there, but she comes in. And the way that she enters is weird because she just kind of comes in at the beginning of the meal. And Jesus is laying down on his side on the ground, up on an elbow, eating his food. And she comes in and she's got an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard. And you know that whenever she walks in, you know this is a big deal because it's a special kind of jar. Alabaster is a type of really thin marble. And so they would use it for things that had to be airtight but also protected from sunlight. And it couldn't be in just a clay jar. They would use these alabaster jars. And she walks up, and so you already know, like, there's no label on it, but you know it's expensive because of the kind of jar it's in. It's special. She walks up, and then she does something absolutely crazy. She doesn't pop the cork out and dump it, but she breaks it. Does any of y'all grow up in butter tub, Tupperware households? Right? Brittany and I have this argument all the time. Like, this is a good container. Why are we throwing it away? And she's like, because it's an old butter container. I'm like, I could put my lunch in this. I don't understand what the problem is. They didn't have disposable products. So if there was a jar that could be reused, it was reused. Unless the event was incredibly significant. It would be used, especially when it's an expensive jar like this. It could be sold and used for this kind of ointment again. But what it means when you break a jar like this is it signifies that the event you're about to go through is so significant that this jar should never be used for anything ever again. So they're all sitting around eating, having a good time, laying on their sides, eating their food. And then she comes in, and in my mind, she's crying. She comes in, and she's got this very special jar, and everybody kind of gets quiet because why is she carrying around this thing that's super expensive? We're told that this jar of ointment is worth a year's wages. It's really expensive. She comes in, and then she doesn't open it, but she breaks it. Now she's got everybody's attention. Mark tells us that she pours it on his head first. This is a way of anointing someone. If you look at the priests, the way they anointed them, they would pour oil on their head and it would run down. So they would use this as a method of cleaning. It doesn't sound very clean to me, but they would use this as a method of cleaning and brush the oil through their hair and that kind of thing. But for her to walk up and to pour it on his head is an incredibly significant event, and it's not really even anything we can express. Just know that everybody's going to stop what they're doing. As she takes this jar of ointment, this ointment that comes from the Himalayas and has to travel all the way around to get there in a special jar, she breaks the jar and pours it over his head. But Luke tells us that she doesn't just do that. She pours it on his head, and then she pours it on his feet. And she takes her hair down, and she scrubs his feet with her hair. Now, in that society, women kept their hair covered, right? It's whenever you had the flannel graph of Mary, she always had the white piece of cloth over her head because women kept their hair covered. And a woman would take down her hair in front of her husband, basically, in front of her children, maybe, in front of other close family, maybe, but her hair was kept covered as an act of modesty. So for her to take off her head covering, it's really kind of hard for us to grasp this, but it's almost like stripping down a little bit. She's doing something that would be embarrassing for her and that would be offensive to the other people in the room. And that's before she even starts rubbing her hair on somebody's dirty feet. They walked around in sandals in the dust, and so whenever you would come into somebody's house, the first thing that they would do is offer you water to wash your feet with. That was an act of hospitality. If it was an honored guest, you would have a servant wash their feet for them, or you would wash their feet yourself. And so this is an act that they performed. Jesus has probably got clean feet at this point because I'm sure they honored him when he came in. But she goes in and she washes his feet. She pours this oil and rubs it into his feet and takes her hair and scrubs his feet with her hair. And this is just like, we look at this and we say, well, that's weird. But they would look at that and say, that's offensive. That she's even taking her hair out in front of us is offensive. That she is touching a man like this that she is not married to is offensive. It's improper. It should not be done. That she's wasted this. And that's when we get into this next verse. Verse 4, there were some who said to themselves indignantly, why was this ointment wasted like this? Why was it wasted like this? For the ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they scolded her. We're told in, I believe it's in John, we're told that the reason that they were upset was because Judas was stealing from the treasury. And he said, this could have been sold and put in the treasury and I could have stolen from it. And so he led everybody else to be upset about it, claiming it was about the poor. But Jesus said to her, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them, but you will not always have me. We talked about this last week. Jesus defends her and says, y'all got to stop. She is worshiping. She is doing something amazing above and beyond. And yes, it's extravagant. It's a little bit offensive, but it is worship of me. Leave her alone. And this is what he says in verse 8. She has done what she could. She has done, I love that, that's my favorite phrase in this whole thing. She has done what she could. You know that awful Christmas song, Little Drummer Boy? It's a terrible song. Hate it. It's a terrible song about a boy who thinks the best thing to do for a postpartum mother and a newborn is to play a drum solo. This is not a good song. But there is a line in the song. And he says, I have no gift to give. I have no gift to bring that's fit to give a king. So I'll play my best for you. I have nothing that is worthy to be given to you. So I'm just going to do what I can. And what Jesus says is what she has done is the only thing she could do. And I receive that as an act of worship. Regardless if it's appropriate, just like it's not appropriate for the drum solo, it's not appropriate. It might be offensive. But she wanted to worship, and this was all she could think to do. And I accept that. She has done what she could. Do you realize the comfort we should find in the phrase, she has done what she could? What that means is that he accepts the worship as it's intended and not as it's expressed. You get in fights in your house, arguments because you said one thing and somebody else heard something else, right? You said something and the other person heard it differently than the way that you intended it. God is not offended by your inability to express what you're trying to say. She has done what she could. He knows what you're doing, and when you attempt to worship, he understands. Regardless of what it is that you're offering or how good you are at offering, she has done what she could. And he says, she has anointed my body beforehand for burial. Everybody else had ignored, right? He said, I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be beaten, I'm going to be tried, I'm going to die. 3 days later, I'm going to come back from the dead. And they're like, oh, that's weird. Okay. And then move forward. Over and over and over again this happens. But he says, she is the only one that heard me. And she worshiped me. Because she can't stop the political upheaval that's coming. She can't interfere with what's about to happen. She can't intervene and make it go away. All she can do is worship. And I accept that. Truly, I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. He says, you're offended that she took her hair out. You're offended that she spent this money on worship. You're offended by all that, but I tell you, I will ensure that this act of worship, this extravagant act of worship, above and beyond just saying the right thing and doing the right thing and sharing what you have, I will ensure that this extravagant act of worship will be shared with everyone around the world that hears the gospel as an example of worship. She went above and beyond just the regular everyday worship that we should be offering from the moment we wake up to the moment that we go to bed, and instead offered something extravagant. And so my question is, first of all, are we worshiping just at the baseline level? With our words, with our actions, with what we have? And if we are, then are we ready to go beyond that to something extravagant? There's a few stories about extravagant worship throughout the Bible, and we can learn a few things about what separates just the daily worship from the extravagant worship. Most of that comes from the story right here. But the first thing that we learn about extravagant worship is extravagant worship costs you something. A sacrifice isn't a sacrifice unless it's a sacrifice. We sacrifice things that don't cost us anything. That's not a sacrifice. Where did she get the money? I don't know. Where did she come up with a jar of ointment that cost a year's salary? I have no idea. But she did. And for her to worship with that way cost her significantly. But extravagant worship always does. There's a story about David at the end of his life, King David at the end of his life. He sins against God, and God allows him to choose the punishment, and he chooses God himself punishing him and them. And he says, you'll be more merciful than all these other things. I choose you to punish me. And David is standing there, and he's watching the punishment come over himself and over his people. And he says, God, please, can we stop this? And God says, you can stop this. I want you to go to the top of this hill, and I want you to buy this threshing floor. And while you're there, I want you to set up an altar, and I want you to worship right there. So David and his entourage run to this hill, and they run up the hill, and they go up there, and there are guys up there on top of this hill, and all of a sudden the king and his entourage are there, and this is kind of a scary situation. And he gets there, and he says, I need this place right now. I'm going to buy it from you. I'm going to worship God right here. And he says, and Aruna is the guy's name. Arauna, I think, is what the guy's name is. He says, I'll just give it to you. I'll give you the floor. I'll give you the hill. I'll give you the oxen that I've got right here. I'll give you the wood from the building. You cut it, tear it all down, offer the sacrifice right now. I'll give it to you. And this is what David says in 2 Samuel 24:24. He says, but the king said to Arauna, says to Arauna, no, but I will buy it from you for a price. I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing. I will not pretend that it's a sacrifice when it doesn't cost me something. And he worships on that hill, and that hill becomes the site where they build the temple. And all the future sacrifices will take place on that hill. David says, if I'm going to worship God, it has to cost me something. You think about the Old Testament worship. They didn't just, let's show up and sing a song, and it's an hour out of the week. No, they didn't do that. They had to give up part of their flock. They had to take their money and go out and buy an expensive animal and give it to God. It cost them something. And the cost made the sacrifice dear to them. Extravagant worship will always, always, always cost you. Extravagant worship is undignified. Matt Redman has a song, and I think that came out when I was, probably still a teenager. I will dance, I will sing to be mad for my King. Nothing, Lord, can hinder me. Stop this passion in my soul, something like that. But it was all about undignified worship, that I'm not going to worship in a way that makes everybody still think I'm a pretty cool guy. Not that everybody's ever been confused about that. But I'm going to worship for an audience of one, and I don't really care what anybody else thinks about me. You think about this woman, what she did, and she comes in, and she does something that is equivalent to taking her top off, okay? In front of all these people, and she does that, and they're offended, and she's embarrassed, but she worships anyway. It is undignified, and that's what makes it extravagant, because it says it's not about my dignity, it's about His dignity. And if I have to abase myself to lift Him up, that's okay. She worships, and it's undignified. There's another story about David. David went to go get the Ark of the Covenant. The kids are learning about the Ark of the Covenant today. It was a central focus of the way that they worshiped in the Old Testament. And we're not going to go into all that, but it was a box that they had and they would worship over it. But the problem is that it moved around quite a bit. It was kind of scattered all over the place until David built the temple. And as he's conquered Jerusalem, he's ready to set up a place of worship. We're not to the temple yet, but he says, the Ark needs to be here with me. So he goes to get it. He doesn't read the Bible. He doesn't check into how these things should be done. He throws it on a cart and takes it to town. Well, it starts to fall off the cart, and one guy reaches up and touches it, and he dies because you're not supposed to, only certain people are supposed to touch the ark. That's what God had said about it. They didn't check. They didn't bother to even check. And this guy dies because he disobeyed God. So David's like, well, this is scary, and he's also mad about this, that he's trying to do something nice for God, and God didn't appreciate it very much. So he drops it off at this one guy's house, and then he goes back home. But then he reads the scripture about what God actually said about how to worship him and how to move this box and who could touch this box. And he comes back with the right people and does it in the right way, but he does something different. He takes off all his kingly clothes. He takes off his royal robes and all these things, and he just puts on a linen undergarment called an ephod that the priests wore. He said, I'm not going to hold on to my glory as king with all these royal robes and all this jewelry. I will just be dressed in just a linen shift, just a linen undergarment. And this isn't going to be about me, but this is going to be about God. And he leads the worship parade and dances the whole way in worship to God. And he goes through town and he's dancing and worshiping all the way back. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 14 says that Daniel danced before the Lord with all his might and was wearing a linen ephod. That's what he did. He wore it all the way into town. And his wife got really upset about it. You say, well, that doesn't sound like a big deal. His wife, one of his wives, was really upset because she said, this is not dignified. This isn't dignified at all. But extravagant worship is not dignified. In fact, you will be abased by extravagant worship. The third thing that always happens with extravagant worship is always, always, always ridiculed by other people. They said to Mary, what are you doing? Like, we could have helped so many people with this. What are you doing? Why are you dumping this out? Why do you have your hair out? You immodest, vulgar woman. Jesus, why are you allowing this to happen? And what he received as worship, they saw as offensive, and they ridiculed her. They attacked her for that worship. But her audience was not them. Her audience was him. David dances all the way back at the front of this worship parade. And he decides the last thing he's going to do is he's going to go to his house and he's going to bless his wives and his kids. He's going to offer this blessing to them as the last act of worship. 2 Samuel 6:20, he returns to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. Well, look who made a fool of himself today. He walks in to celebrate this worship, and his first wife says, you sure acted like a king today. Everybody out there watching you dancing around like a fool. But David says this, it was before the Lord. What does she say? She said how the king of Israel honored himself today. Her focus was all about, this is embarrassing to you. It's embarrassing to me. Look at what you did to yourself. But what did David say? He said, it was not for me, and it wasn't as an audience for you, and it wasn't for those women that you're talking about being out there. I did this for the Lord, who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord. The only reason I'm king is because he made me king. I do not deserve this because of who I am. You might be born to a king, but I wasn't. And he has raised me up. And you're going to tell me not to worship him when he knows how low I truly am? This is not for you, and it's not for them, but it's for him. I will celebrate before the Lord. And you know what? I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. If this is how you feel about my worship of God, understand that it's about to get worse. Extravagant worship always costs you something, embarrasses you in a way, and will lead to ridicule. Always does. But the fact that you are willing to pay the price, that you are willing to be undignified, whatever it costs you, and that you are willing to accept the ridicule, makes the worship more valuable, because what it says is He is the only one that matters. His opinion is the only one that counts. It doesn't matter what these other people think. This is for Him, it's not for them. But what do? We say, I'm not going to worship because it'll cost me. And I don't want to take away from me. We say, I'm not going to worship like this because it's going to be embarrassing and I don't want to endure the hurt to my pride. I'm not going to worship like this because other people are going to think less of me. And the thing that stops you from worshiping extravagantly is the pride and self-love that says, I am worth more than him. David said, how could I not worship after all that he has done for me? And I just want to ask you the same question. If you are struggling with this idea of extravagant worship, if you're struggling with baseline worship because of what it'll cost you or what it'll look like to other people, I just want to ask you a question. What was it that made it worthwhile to David? What was it that made it worthwhile to Mary? It was all that God had done for them or was about to do for them. And I ask, has he done nothing for you? You know what he did for me? Me, an enemy of God, a rebel against God who had decided I was going to decide right and wrong for myself. I was going to decide what the right course for my life was. I was going to be my own God. You know what he did for me? He died for me because I had earned the punishment of death. And he said, I don't want Ben to die forever in hell. I want him to be back with me where he's supposed to be. And so instead, I will offer myself as a sacrifice for him so that he can pay my death for his crimes. And then I will come back to life and I won't just keep him from going to hell by paying that penalty, but instead I will offer him resurrection and eternal life so that he might live with me forever. And then he said that the Father is going to adopt him into the family so that he shares in my inheritance. And then from that point forward, regardless of what he does, he will still have that. It doesn't matter how bad he messes up. It doesn't matter what he does. Forgiveness is there. All sins are paid for from before the moment that he asks for forgiveness until at the very end, the last sin he commits, that will be paid for. And he has done that for me. And yet I'm going to say it's cost too much to worship. I'm going to say it's too embarrassing to worship. I'm going to say it's too undignified and people are going to ridicule me for that worship. If that's your response, you clearly don't understand what has been given for you, because what has been done for me is the same thing that's been done for you. And if you realize that you're a sinner that is destined for hell and death, and you believe that he is the Son of God that can rescue you and cry out to him for rescue, you will share in the same things that I have. And if you share in that forgiveness, you share in that rescue, I do not understand how there can be too much asked of you when it comes to extravagant worship. I do not understand how embarrassment or cost or the ridicule of others could hold you back. And you say, Ben, I'm struggling with baseline worship. I'm struggling with baseline worship. I can't get this stuff done in the middle of the day, and I definitely don't know how I'm going to find something extravagant to offer to God. I want to tell you one more thing about extravagant worship. Every time we see extravagant worship in the Bible, it comes directly after hearing from God. Every time. Why did Mary worship the way that she did? Because she listened to what Jesus said, and that provoked a response of worship in her. Why did David worship the second time but not the first time? Because the first time he didn't check into what God had to say. But the second time, when he did what he was required to do as king, and he read the law, and he read the instructions for how to move the Ark of the Covenant, when he read all of that, the response that it provoked in him was to dance in a worship parade all through town, no matter what it cost him. You say, I struggle to worship. You say, the idea of extravagant worship is so far beyond me because I can't even get regular worship. Here's what I want to tell you your problem is. Your problem is that you're not spending time with God. If you will spend time in the Word and in prayer, the response will be worship. You say, I don't know why I feel so far from God. I just never talk to Him. I never listen to Him. I show up to church. I don't sing any of the songs because I don't really like them. Ben preaches too long. But I don't understand why I'm so far from God. You want to worship? Open your Bible. Spend time in the Word. Respond to Him in prayer. And what will happen in you is a desire for worship that you will have to contain or allow to go free. Are you a worshiper? Do you worship at that baseline level of worship? That the words you say are said because they honor and glorify God? Are you a worshiper that the things you do because you want to honor and glorify God? Are you a worshiper who shares what you have because of what's been shared with you and you want to honor God by sharing that? If not, then I would encourage you to accept the gift that He's offered of salvation and forgiveness. And if you say, you know what, I'm not a worshiper, but I've also received that gift already, then I just have to say, what's wrong with you? How can you not worship? You have some things that you need to deal with in your heart. Because after all that He's offered me, I don't know how I could not worship. Spend time in the Word. Spend time in prayer. And allow Him to produce that worship in you. And then when we come in here and we have worship time, it won't just be the name, but it will be the first step in the worship that you give to Him all week long. But I can't affect that. We can't choose songs that will make you worship better. We can't have programs that will make you worship better. This is a response that has to come from you. So will you worship now? And will you make the worship now not be the worship for the week, but the worship that starts a pattern of worship throughout the week and leads to extravagant worship when He calls you to it? Will you do that? Stand with me, please. Our Heavenly Father, we come before You right now, and I'm so grateful that You, as You said to Mary, as You said about Mary, that You accept what we have to offer. That You don't demand something that's beyond our grasp, beyond our reach, but rather You accept what we have to offer. And Lord, I don't have a lot to offer. But I ask that You would make us into people through time in Your Word and time with You in prayer, Lord, that You would make us into people who offer You what we have. I ask, Lord, that if there's anyone here today that has not accepted the gift that You have, they don't worship because they don't recognize what it is that's been done for them. They've not received that they would receive it today. They would cry out to You for rescue and be saved today. But for those of us who have been saved, who are not worshiping, Lord, I ask that You would turn the spotlight on us and help us to see why it is that we're not worshiping. How sad it is that we're not worshiping. And that You would lead us to a place of daily and extravagant worship. It's in Jesus' name I pray these things, Lord. Amen.